You're listening to NorthWoods Church Matters, a podcast of NorthWoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. Hey, welcome back to the NorthWoods Church Matters podcast. I'm here this morning with my friend Nathan.
Hello.
We've been talking about nothing but conflict. And guess what? We're going to talk about conflict again this morning.
I love it.
And maybe a little Taylor Swift, too.
Hey, I'm there.
Okay, cool. Why don't we take it away?
Well, okay, so we're continuing our conversation today about confrontation, which we started talking more specifically about last week. What should we do if a one-on-one confrontation does not work?
I think we got to go back to Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Between you and him alone, if he listens to you, you have gained a brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. But if he refuses to listen to him, go and tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to even the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and tax collector. Now, I think this particular passage has a scary name, which is the church discipline passage. I think the words church discipline kind of gives everybody the heebie-jeebies, and hopefully we can get the heebie-jeebies out of church discipline today. But the main thing to do after you've had the one-on-one confrontation is it says take 1 or 2 others. And really the references that Jesus makes here is to Deuteronomy 19:15 about taking 2 or 3 other people to establish a fact. And so I think the principle here biblically is that the inclusion of more people gets closer to the truth on this judicial level. Of course, we hear the stories about all these people that witnessed the same car wreck, and they have different information and different details and different car color and how many people were in the car and all these different things. And this is why police officers get information from multiple people, is eventually you get to the truth.
Right.
And so that's the principle here, is that the more people that we bring in with more biblical wisdom and more godly wisdom, the more clearly we can get to the truth. And I think that's a good thing. But as we proceed, even though we've gone past the one-on-one confrontation, the purpose is still the same. When Jesus talks about if he listens to you, you've gained a brother. And so the process still is to gain a brother. That purpose doesn't change throughout the process.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it might be worth saying at the top, I'm sure we'll touch on this in other places, but this is an organic process. You can't just read this robotically, like, first I have my first meeting, and then I have my second meeting with additional people, and then I have my third.
It's very fluid.
People will try and make this into the formula, and it is.
Yeah.
But people will try and be so rigid about, which step am I on? Is it time to treat him like an unbeliever? And it's like, well, that's going to take wisdom and discernment to navigate through this, and it's going to look different with different people and in different situations.
Yeah. If we were building a house, this would be more like the scaffolding and not the actual picking out of tile.
Right.
This is not exact detail. This is the framework that we're going around, and some of the exact details that we're getting into can vary from church to church or person to person, and I think that's okay.
Why should we bring another person into the conflict resolution process?
I think there's 3 reasons, and the first one is the one that people think about the most, so that the accusation of sin against the other person can be amplified. And I think that there's a way to do this properly, and there may be certain instances where somebody's stuck in sin, and you need to bring another person with you to point out the vileness of what their sin is. If somebody's stuck in drug addiction, or somebody's stuck in alcoholism or pornography, some sort of stubborn addiction that they've got, you may need to bring somebody else with you to help them to see the damage that they're doing to their families. And this is a legitimate thing that you may need to bring 1 or 2 other people to help somebody see the damage that their sin is causing. But this is what people think about. Like, we're going to bring somebody else and we're going to beat up on that person. Right. And we're just all going to just go key his car after we've had this accusation. Now, this is where I think about Taylor Swift. I've been in Taylor Swift world for a couple days. My daughter went to the concert in Nashville last Friday, and she's been listening to all the music for a long time.
She's a Swiftie.
She's a Swiftie. There's a thing that goes along with being a Swiftie. The Swifties know which boyfriend the songs are about.
Right.
Whether it's John Mayer or the Gyllenhaal guy or Joe Jonas or whoever it's about. And there's this thing where the Swifties like are automatically on the side of Taylor Swift. Is like, how dare John Mayer do that to Taylor Swift? And I was reading something this morning that was just so valid. It was like, you've never heard about like the other side of the equation from any of these people. But sometimes I feel in these situations, the expectation is the person who is wronged is Taylor Swift, and then you're a Swiftie, and your job in going with them is to be their ride or die person, and you're going to back them up all the time. There's two other reasons that you can bring somebody else with you, and I think these are the better reasons. One is just for mediation, and mediation means that there's another party that's brought in to assist the persons in coming up with a mutually agreeable solution. And so the idea here is consensus and compromise. You cannot see your own sin oftentimes, and you need somebody to help you come to a conclusion about your problem. And then another thing would be arbitration. And this is a little bit higher up in the ladder of steps to take, but it means that you bring another party to make a binding decision for you. So you go into the process saying, whatever this person agrees to or comes up with as a solution, we're going to go with it.
We don't trust each other, but we trust this third guy. Exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes you need that. I know some couples that have gotten so stuck in a rut that they just need somebody to tell them what to do. And sometimes it works, and that's just what's needed. I think why people hate this part of the process is they think of the Taylor Swift scenario. Yeah. We're bringing somebody that's going to agree with me, and we're going to go get that guy.
Yeah. I think also, when people think of the Christian life and they think of church life and they think of their marriages, they just think they will know we are Christians by our love.
By our love.
And so that means like we never actually have to escalate a conflict. Like we've failed. If I went to Matt because there was a problem and we talked and we couldn't work it out, that means that we have sinned, we have failed, we get a black mark, And that's not always true. Sometimes you just get in a rut, like you said, in your marriage, or sometimes Christian brothers have wildly different perspectives on things. It is a very good and normal and healthy thing to bring somebody else in with a fresh perspective so that you can figure something out. That's part of knowing that we're Christians by our love. That's part of living in a healthy community, is actually having steps to arbitrate these things.
Yeah. And that's one of the blessings of being a Christian, is that we have this community around us that can help us make these decisions. That you go out through a secular process, whether it be secular counseling or through the court process or something like that, you never know what perspective they're coming from. Whereas if you find another Christian to help you either mediate or arbitrate your situation, then their background and the way that they think and the Holy Spirit that they have is the same as yours. And so that's a good thing.
Okay, so maybe we already covered this, but what role does the additional person play?
Yeah, I think much of the problem in conflict is that we are blind to our own sins and our own pridefulness. We think we're infallible people, and we just need wise people to help us to see our sinfulness. And this goes both ways. Let's acknowledge that sometimes people do need help in seeing their sinfulness, and sometimes you do need to bring somebody else in the equation that says, yeah, this porn problem that you've got really is a problem. And so sometimes you do need to bring somebody else to help you accuse somebody of a problem.
But even there, you're not necessarily choosing, like you would if you were in our Taylor Swift example, you're not choosing the person with the biggest shotgun. Maybe you'll be choosing the person who's most gentle and kind and has a relationship with the person that you're going to accuse. You're figuring out how to win your brother.
Yeah, I think that a TV show that's done a great disservice in this area is that TV show Intervention, where it just sits people down in these wildly strange, addictive situations, and they have a massive amount of people just pile on. The pile on is not what we're going for. What we're going for is gaining a brother.
Right.
So you may want to take the most gentle person with you, or somebody that they trust, or somebody that they're going to listen to you. There are situations in marriage where you're just so stuck in conflict with somebody else, but maybe instead of bringing your best friend, you bring your spouse's best friend, somebody that they're going to listen to, and they're going to acknowledge that there is a problem here. And so sometimes it's helpful just to bring somebody that is a kind ear, or somebody that is a person that will be a listenable ear in the situation.
This is a good question. How do we bring another person into the conflict resolution process?
I think there's two ways. One is we do it informally, which is that maybe my spouse and I are having an issue and we can think of somebody wise in our church that we want to include in the situation. We both agree to it and bring that person in. We both as spouses agree we need counseling. And so we go to a Christian counselor or a solid biblical counselor that we agree upon and let them mediate or arbitrate the situation. And informally, we both agree. But maybe there's some situations where you don't agree on who to bring in, and you do it more formally, where you go to your church and say, we don't know who to ask about this, but we need somebody. And so you let the church appoint somebody or assign somebody to help you with your conflict. And that person could be a counselor, either on staff or somewhere else, or a pastor or a deacon, or there are some churches that have professional peacemakers in the church, and that could be a situation there. And maybe it's just a wise layperson, somebody that's older in years, or maybe even younger in years, that has some experience in a situation, or has a long life experience, or maybe a long marriage, and has lived through the problems of marriage and may have some expertise to give to you. There's lots of different scenarios, but there could be a situation where you just need the church to assign somebody, and I think that's a healthy way to do it too.
I'm thinking about when I was in youth group now, many a year ago. I had a friend that I wanted to confront about something, and I did exactly the thing that no one should ever do, but I'm sure lots of people have done something like this, which is I went and I talked to all of my other friends, and I was like, who's going to confront Bob about this thing? And we all talked about it, and I think we went and saw the youth group leader and said, who's going to confront Bob? And he was just like, have you thought about Matthew 18? Maybe
maybe you
just maybe stop gossiping about Bob. One of y'all confront Bob. But Bob ended up finding out about this, and let's just say it did not help our case.
Oh, I'm sure. What you bring up is in the circles of conflict resolution is like, nobody likes conflict and nobody likes confrontation. And so often we're stuck in this rut of, who's going to talk to Bob about his porn problem?
Right.
And it winds up being nobody, because nobody wants to do it.
Yeah, just
poor Bob.
Draw straws. Poor Bob. Well, okay. So what do we do if bringing an additional person into the process doesn't solve the conflict?
According to Matthew 18, we take it to the church. And I think people just don't like this because there's so many bad examples of this that are out there, that bad pictures from churches that have done just a bad job with this. And I think that somewhat justly, this is an area where non-Christians critique the church because we have done a bad job on this. And I think they're right to often critique us about doing a bad job on this. And because of the bad job the church has generally done on this, is we feel like this church discipline process is like Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter, where it's all about public humiliation, that instead of gaining a brother, what we're going for is this church tribunal that is going to condemn the sinner and humiliate them so nobody else does what this person has ever done again. And unfortunately, I think that's the idea of some churches, is just to, we're going to bring up this sin because we want to set an example with this person so nobody ever does this ever again. And that's not the motivation of this passage. There's a manner to bring it to the church lovingly and kindly and without the humiliation factor, and to try to gain a brother.
And I think one of the unfortunate things that's happened is we see stories like Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're scared of the whole topic of church discipline. And a thing that I think people have to understand is one of the reasons that a story like that can happen is because there's not good church discipline out there as much as there should be. And so people don't really have anything to compare it to. And so they let themselves be taken advantage of by people because they're like, is this what the Bible's talking about? And so the solution to that can't be no church discipline, because that's actually where the kind of freakish stuff happens, because people are then like, it says we should have it, so I guess it looks like Scarlet Letter.
Right. Churches often shy away from church discipline because they see the wrongs that have been done and they go the completely opposite direction. We're not going to be like Mars Hill, because there's so many things that have been done wrongly in Jesus' name that it's so tainted now that we're just not going to touch that at all. I think that there's a way to do something in between. Instead of being heavy-handed, we are doing it in a spirit of love and gentleness and kindness, trying to restore our brother in Christ. And I will say towards Mars Hill that I think the key problem there is authoritarianism in the church, that often church discipline goes wrong because there is a pastor or somebody that has no accountability whatsoever and is dictatorial in what they do. And their interest is controlling the church or gaining power or preserving power versus actually caring about the people and shepherding the people that they've got. And that's when you get into a Mars Hill situation. And that's when church discipline does become dangerous, because you've got one person with no input who is just making wild decisions on behalf of the church.
Which is interesting, because there you could say, well, actually, the solution to that problem wasn't less church discipline. It was actually more church discipline, in that we needed some discipline of
the pastor. Yeah.
We needed people that were willing to confront him, that wanted to do this process. And when you have a lack of it, that's when you actually get that kind of authoritarianism.
Yeah. And the churches like that can get deep down the rabbit hole, because you listen to that podcast and you hear stories about there were some brave people that did confront Mark Driscoll on certain situations, and they got canned. And that's a way of preserving power, is that anybody that dares defy what I think of the matter, I'm going to humiliate them or subjugate them, or I'm going to fire them, or just do away with their opinion one way or another.
Yeah. All too common of a story, unfortunately.
Yeah.
How do we bring it to the church?
I think where to go to here is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where it's talking about lawsuits against believers. It says, when one of you has a grievance against another, does he dare go to law before the unrighteous instead of the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more then matters pertaining to this life? So if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to settle a dispute between the brothers? And just reading that aloud, like, that's some of the harshest language in all of 1 Corinthians that he has for these folks in the church that are bringing these lawsuits against other believers and not bringing in the church. The local church should have more wisdom and authority than the secular courts. So secular courts, they're needed and they do have their place, but for the Christian, we need to have regard for the church's decision-making more than the courts. When it gets further into Matthew 18, Jesus starts talking all this language about binding and loosing authority, and sometimes that just loses us because we're not Jewish and we're not in the middle of Jewish culture. But binding and loosing was this Jewish legal term, and it talks about the judicial authority of the synagogue, that they have this power of biblical interpretation for the Old Testament, of finding out what is lawful or not lawful. Remembering the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Somebody's got to interpret, okay, so what does that mean? And does somebody really violate that or not violate that? And so that type of authority of biblical interpretation has been given to the church. And so together, collectively, with the wisdom of the word and the power of the Holy Spirit, we should be able to make those type of decisions. I think we also bring it to the church by keeping it limited. Like, I don't think that every situation needs to be, let's have a public flogging of this particular person. I think letting pastors and elders lead in the situation is also a good thing. Not every situation requires a public trial. Sometimes just leaders need to get involved, and that's enough to move the needle on the situation. And I think it's also good to have an attitude of humbleness. We need to realize that maybe we're not right, and maybe we do have our own faults. And in addition, our goal is to gain a brother. And so we need to come to the church, if we're going to bring it to the church, with this attitude of humility. And then I think one thing that helps just overall, as we're talking about bringing it to the church, it helps if we have a culture of peace in the local church, and not division and divisiveness. That let's not be a culture of backstabbers, and let's not be a culture of people that just ignore problems. If our culture already is, we're trying to help each other to grow in the Christian life and to solve conflicts and live at peace with one another. You know, when these bigger situations arise, we already have that culture and it's not foreign to us, and we're not backstabbing each other over the color of the carpet or whether drums are being played in church or hymns or modern worship music. If we're trying to get along with each other, that goes a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what do we do if bringing it to the church doesn't work?
If bringing it to the church doesn't work, then the next step is treat someone like a non-believer. And I know that people don't like this step, but it's in Scripture, not only here, but multiple times. Like Titus 3:10 says, as for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him. 2 Thessalonians 3:14 through 15. If anyone does not obey what we say in this letter, take note of that person and have nothing to do with him, that they may be ashamed. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother.
Right.
This is the exact same language in Paul as in Jesus. And in 2 John 9 through 10, everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in this teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. There's multiple occasions in Scripture, not just here, where it talks about there comes a time when you realize that someone in the stubbornness of their own sin has given away the game,
Right.
shown what his true colors are, and we do not greet that person in the same type of fellowship that we greet other believers. We treat them as a non-believer. We treat the person trapped in stubborn sin like an unconverted man, and the goal now turns in the process. We're trying to lovingly restore somebody, but also it turns to this process of evangelism.
Right.
This person needs to know Jesus, and it's very likely this person doesn't know Jesus, who is just trapped in their sins. I think often this whole process, and this is an aside, I think often this whole process doesn't work because people have this low view of the church's authority and the church's wisdom. You'll often see that if people don't like their local church's opinion, they'll just jump to another church. And I think it goes beyond just consumerism. I think it's deeper than that. I think it's pride. We think we're right. When you meet lots of people that they'll jump churches because they have a disagreement and the church does not side with them in their opinion. And so they will just jump to another church that does side with their opinion. And I think if we had a higher regard for our church and our leaders, then maybe we could have some more solutions that are more constructive without church-ship jumping.
Yeah.
Now, I want to just acknowledge here that some people are hesitant to bring their problem to the church because they know that their church will not handle it well.
Yeah, certainly.
The Mars Hill situation comes to mind. And there are churches that just make bad decisions, covering up abuse or telling a woman to go back home and be submissive to an abusive husband. Yeah. Those are bad decisions.
Absolutely.
And when the church makes a decision that violates God's law, follow God's law.
Yeah,
but I think that those are rare situations.
What do we do if the person is a non-believer? Should we bring it to the church, quote unquote?
Yeah, I don't think that this process really is applicable to non-believers. Jesus is talking about conflict here between two brothers in the faith or two sisters in the faith or what have you. They're talking about two believers. But I think that there's wisdom in using the process. And we can still follow the framework because I think the framework is good and healthy regardless of whether the person is a believer or non-believer, is to confront somebody one-on-one and then in a healthy manner involve one or two more people and then take it to a much larger group of people. With a non-believer, there is an option there where we do take it through the court process and we do take legal recourse because we have no other means of doing that. It's not like somebody's going to submit to a church to make a binding decision for them. But for believers, I think that there's reasons to avoid the court process. It's not entirely avoidable, but I think that we need to submit to the authority of the church. But with non-believer, you don't have that type of authority. So there may be situations where Christians need to take things to court and take that recourse with a non-believer.
Sure. Yeah. Makes total sense. I will say I have found that for all the people that you see who just hate God, for all the news stories you see about people that hate God, for all the movies you see where the pastor's the bad guy or whatever,
God's Not Dead 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, exactly. I do find life doesn't exactly reflect those movies. There are many people that do have just a kind of a healthy general fear of God. Pagan people that will go to hell if they don't give themselves to Jesus. But they don't actually mind the idea of a pastor arbitrating. Or they have some respect for the church one way or another. Maybe it's just cultural. Who knows where it comes from? It might be different for different people. But I have found it's surprising how much people are actually willing to just, hey, can you talk to my pastor? You always kind of assume people's hackles will get up and they'll bristle at that sort of thing. But actually, that's not always true.
Yeah, and I think that the basic theme here is when we show people basic love, honor, and respect, it's amazing what can happen in terms of conflict resolution. With a non-believer, if we sat down one-on-one with somebody, I think people would be amazed at how many problems would actually get solved. Mm-hmm. And thinking about work conflict situations, often people skip this step all the time.
Right.
What is the first step when somebody's in conflict with somebody at work? They go to their boss. Mm-hmm. Well, what would happen if you just, in kindness and gentleness and respect, went to that person one-on-one to talk about that conflict before you involve somebody else?
Yeah.
I think that's very wise, and I think that a lot of people would be willing to do that. Of course, there's the jerky person that you complain to them that their lunch smells, mm-hmm. and could they eat somewhere else? They'll be like, no, I can do whatever I want. There's going to be people that are out there like that, but at least you've tried to be kind and generous, and that reflects well on you.
I know I've been on the other side of that where I'm like, I didn't know that me putting paper clips on the partition between our cubicles bugged this person, and now the boss is talking to me about it? Why didn't they just look over the cubicle and say, hey, Nathan, could you not do that? Like, they escalated it and accidentally created some bad feelings in me. That's not a real example, but I've had those kinds of examples happen.
Sure.
Where it's just like a simple conversation. But sometimes people are just insecure or scared And
this happens to people in church too. It's any given Sunday, someone will come up to a pastor and say, I've got a problem with so-and-so. I need you to fix it. Mm-hmm. The first thought running through a pastor's mind is, what have you done to go one-on-one and address the situation?
Right.
And instead of running to the pastor first, maybe you should have a one-on-one confrontation with a person. There is a time and a place to bring a pastor, but not until you've exhausted some other steps. Yeah.
Well, we already touched on this, but let me just ask you directly. What about courts and the legal process? Is that a good resource for a Christian?
I think if you're dealing with believer-to-believer type of conflicts, it isn't, because we as the church should have the competency, the wisdom, the authority to handle these situations. And I think that often this is just because we have a low view of the church.
Right. Yeah.
That we are an outpost, an emissary of God's kingdom here on earth. And if we have a higher view of the church, then I think we'd be surprised at what type of situations would just get handled. Now, is there a place to involve the courts? Sure. One type of situation would be if somebody is engaging in a criminal act.
Sure.
We need to take that to the police and through the judicial system. And then there are situations where the state has a particular authority and the church does not. Mm-hmm. Marriage is a God thing, that God created it. But in the United States of America, the government gets a decision over who can get married and who can get divorced.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's not something that the church can just say, blah, 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 let's recite some vows and you're hereby divorced from this person. I mean, legally, you have to go through that. So even if somebody is getting what the Bible would say is a legal divorce, let's say your husband has committed just foul infidelity and he's proven himself to be a non-believer and has deserted you and stranded the family, like even if there's just clear evidence that this by all means is a biblical divorce, mm-hmm. you still got to go to court to introduce a divorce proceeding. It's just the realm of where we live. And there's going to be certain things that in order to get something done, you have to go to the courts. I think of another situation would be getting a restraining order. Your spouse is abusing you and there's a reason to get a restraining order. You have to go to court to do that. So this is not saying you should never, ever, 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 ever go to court. And
Right.
I feel like there's some Christians that read 1 Corinthians 6 and just look down their brow at anybody that uses a court process whatsoever. And really what Paul is getting at in 1 Corinthians 6 isn't the fact that somebody's used a court. It's the fact that they haven't gone to the church first.
Right.
And like, if your first recourse of dealing with somebody is instead of using Matthew 18 to sue somebody, that's just wrong.
Right.
That's just terrible. Paul has all manner of awful things to say through the word for those type of people. And so there is a time and place for the courts. They do have a purpose, and we do need to honor the authority that God has put in place, but we need to get the order right.
Final question. Is there ever a reason to skip steps or fast forward this conflict resolution process?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think like the illustration we keep using is this is the scaffolding,
Right.
and this is the basic process. And I think one example is criminal cases.
Yeah.
We've got to honor the government and the proper authorities. So the church, like, we can't ignore the criminal process just because we have Matthew 18
Right.
and say, we haven't gone through all these steps yet, so we can't report somebody for child abuse. No, that's not the way it works. So if we find out child abuse, we call the police or protective services. If we found spousal abuse, we call the police. If somebody's stealing, we call the police. If somebody's using drugs, we call the police. And just because we want to help people doesn't mean that we should break the law.
Right. I'm sure you know the stories. I know the stories where it's just these really sad cases, child molestation type stuff, where they didn't just go to the authorities. There's all kinds of reasons for that, but sometimes they are trying to do some version of a process.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, skip some steps, guys.
Yeah. And that's one thing we've talked about in the podcast before is if we as NorthWoods find out abuse, we report.
Right.
We're not called to be investigators.
Right.
We're called to report. Let DCS be the investigators. We don't want to tie their hands by saying, we knew about this for 6 months, but we went through this process. We've investigated it on our own, and we found out that's really not going to fly. That's going to make us culpable in what happens.
Right. You're not the priest in the gangster movie that keeps everybody's secrets.
Right, exactly. And knows all the bad stuff, knows all the dirt. And I think there's situations where the magnitude of the sin often determines the magnitude of the response, where if there's child abuse that's reported and it requires a hard response. We can't just dawdle through the process. Sometimes we're just called to send it straight up the ladder. You may not have the time or the means to have this drawn up process. You just need to immediately take action. That's fine. This is a framework. And sometimes we have to fast forward the framework because of the seriousness of what's going on.
Right. Well, I also think another one that gets really tricky is many times grossly public sin can require a public response. And it's not that we want to just flog somebody. You see the bad examples of somebody is exposed in a sin and that it immediately goes to the whole church. And I think we talked about that on a podcast. But you'll also have things like, well, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill would be an extreme example. There are people who are like, well, did the investigative journalists in that thing, did they talk to Mark first? Did they follow the process? And it's like, the sin was big enough and public enough that a public response was required.
Yeah.
And that can happen.
Using church funds to buy thousands of books to put the particular book on the New York Times bestseller list.
Right, yeah.
Misuse of church funds. What could be more clearer than that?
And there's a biblical precedent for that. Paul talks about seeing Peter not eating with the Gentiles.
Yeah.
And he says he confronted him. It sounds like
Public confrontation.
Public confrontation for a public sin.
Yeah.
And I think they were both cool and friends, and Peter repented from what we can tell after that. But
yeah. But I think he did the right thing, too. It says, I confronted him to his face.
Yeah.
Instead of gossiping to everybody in the church, it was like, did you see Peter and what he did? Paul's like, no, let's solve this. Let's go to his face and let's just talk about this and figure out what's going on. Paul had some guts, I bet.
Yeah.
Let me just close by saying, I think a good takeaway from this is that I don't think that we use the church as a resource well in general. I think that we as Christians could do a much better job of letting the church be peacemakers. And if we did that, we'd be a much healthier church. If you can't solve a conflict, get the church to counsel you, ask the church to mediate your conflict, or even in certain situations, you may need somebody to arbitrate a conflict and come up with some sort of binding solution to your conflict. And that's what the church is there for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, guys, we're going to rule over angels. And so maybe the church has the right wherewithal to figure out these situations. And so let's use the church wisely. That's what we're here for, is to help you solve conflict. If we thought of the church more as we're an outpost and an emissary of God's kingdom here on earth, then we would go to the church more to solve problems, because we're a representation of the kingdom. We are God's kingdom here on earth, and we have God's people that have been given the authority to bind and loose and to interpret and to help us be in peace with one another.
Thanks for tuning in to the NorthWoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about NorthWoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.